share screen, so you can
Right.
share your slides. When we are done, if you can just click on my name on the screen and make me the co-host again, then I can run the rest of the meeting. So we see your presentation on the screen. I think Bob was kind enough to allow people to ask questions during the presentation. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and then ask a question. And then once you're done, just please mute yourself again. And if everybody can mute themselves now so that we don't interrupt Bob unless you want to ask a question, I will now turn it over to Bob Stan.
Well, thanks a lot, Nancy. I hope you can hear me okay. Hello. Okay. Had me worried there for a minute. Okay, as you can see, Electronically Assisted Astronomy, or How I Love to Learn NGC Objects. And the reason I have that subtitle is if you've done observing for any period of time, you're used to seeing NGC objects listed in catalogs. And NGC stands for New General Catalog. And it's the New General Catalog because it was published in 1898 originally, and it replaced older catalogs. But as I look back over my observing logs for the last 50 or so years, invariably it says NGC object, dim spot. NGC object, couldn't find. NGC object, no detail. And they're very dim in the most part. There are some spectacular ones, but generally they're dim. And it was only when I started EAA that I realized that I could actually see them very well. But to get on to the presentation, well, what's wrong with my slides? There we go. Okay, the definition of EAA, and it's a simple definition. It's using an electronic device instead of an eyepiece on an astronomical telescope for near real-time viewing. And that's really the near real-time is what makes the difference between EAA and astrophotography. It sort of lies halfway, we'll say, between visual astronomy and astrophotography. You have equipment, you take pictures, but you don't do all the processing that's required for good astrophotography. So why do it? Well, it's a different way to observe. I can guarantee you that you'll see details through EAA that you would never see in your scope visually. If you use a color camera, you're going to see color. And to me, that's one of the most impressive things about it. The other thing is it's an easier way or an easy way to share views with those who are not astronomy minded or used to looking through a telescope. How many of you have been at a star party and had someone hold their son or daughter up to the telescope and say, Johnny or Sally, do you see that nebula? And the kid is shaking his head, yes, and you know he's not seeing anything. Well, through EAA, because he's looking at a big screen, you know that they're going to see something. The other thing is it's kind of an introduction to astrophotography. You get to use equipment, you get to take pictures, and you get to see your results immediately. And you don't need to know a lot to actually get an image that you can appreciate. It helps overcome light pollution. Even in light polluted skies, you can see dim objects. You can also view dim galaxies during moonlight. All the pictures that I'll show later on here were all taken at least a quarter moon, and many of them during a full moon. So you can maximize your observing nights. Here in central New York, I've had about 4 observing nights in the last 2 months, and 2 of them were full moon. So, you know, I have to take advantage of whatever I can get. And the last thing is it's a major step towards remote observing, where you can sit inside your house and still observe. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, this is a week or 2 ago. It's 3 p.m. It was 6 degrees outside. That's my scope. And I observed that night from about 7 to midnight. It was -2. And I can tell you that if I was out at a telescope, I would not be at it for 5 hours when it's -2. But remote observing allowed me to do that. To do that, you need to have EAA equipment, and that's really the only relation. This is my scope. We'll talk about it a little later. And this is EAA software. This is something called Starlight Live. And I just wanted to show you, this is what I would see on my computer screen. And what I would do is point to an object and start taking photographs of it. This is a 10-second exposure. So if you keep watching that dark screen, this is the first exposure. All right, bright stars come in, a little bit of nebulosity. Now, by the time the second frame comes up, many of you will be able to tell what it is. This is not an example of perfect astrophotography, but this is something that I had never seen before. This is the Trifid Nebula. I have seen it before through my scope, but never with color. And that's what EAA allows me to do. So as each of these images come in, you'll see it gets a little stronger on the screen and you can see a little more detail. So that's basically what EAA is. It's using a camera to view celestial objects and get pretty impressive pictures. Not quality-wise, but the chance to see something. All right, so if you're going to do EAA, what kind of equipment do you need to have? And in many cases, you'll find you can use stuff you already have. Okay, first of all, you need to have a telescope and you need to have a tracking mount, preferably a mount that has GOTO capability, a mount that you can tell to go point at an object and it will do that. Now, there are people that do this without tracking mounts and do it without GOTO, and it's possible. But by and large, a tracking mount with GOTO is a more pleasurable way to get involved with it. So when we talk about mounts, two basic types of mount for astronomy: the equatorial mount on the left and the alt-azimuth mount on the right. Now, equatorial mounts are normally on a tripod and not handheld, but that was the only photo I could find. An equatorial mount revolves around one axis, the one marked with an arrow. You can look at that as kind of like a clock face. It's right ascension. It moves from left to right if you're looking at it in the front, and then it pivots around the other axis. So when you're using, when you're using these mounts, with an equatorial mount, if a star rises in the east and sets in the west, theoretically, I could track that image or that star all the way across the sky, only revolving around the one axis. Now, when I started in astronomy, if you were going to take any pictures at all, you would need an equatorial mount. There was absolutely no way to do it with an alt-azimuth mount. Today, the situation is different, especially for EAA. Alt-azimuth mounts also have drive capability, and they move kind of like this representation I've shown over just to the right of that image, that little stair step. So if it's tracking a star in the east, it may be moving up, then over, and then up, and then over, and then up, and then over. And it can track a star very accurately for short periods of time without any ill effects. So whether you have an equatorial mount or an alt-azimuth mount, you can do EAA. Now, if you're an astrophotographer, there are a lot of disadvantages to alt-azimuth. And one of the disadvantages is if you see the star to the left of that nebula, that's not the North Star, it's just the one the telescope is pointed at. And you can see that the stars all seem to rotate around that point. And that's called field rotation. And it happens because of the way the alt-azimuth telescope moves. You would not have that issue with an equatorial mount. But I have to say, if you're doing EAA, makes no difference. You're going to be taking short enough exposures to where this is not a factor, and the software that you use will compensate for that. So what kind of telescope can you use? I guess the answer is, what kind of telescope do you have? Obviously, the three major types, refractor, reflector, and Schmidt-Cassegrain, are all acceptable for EAA. They all have their own advantages, and they all have their own disadvantages. So whatever kind of telescope you have, you can learn to cope with it. The refractor is generally compact, generally very expensive. The reflector is very good value for money, but it may require modifications to get a camera to focus. The Schmidt-Cassegrain is a very compact telescope, but it's also very heavy, and it has a very long focal length for its size. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. When we're talking about telescopes, these are the two most important factors: focal length and F ratio. And this is as technical as I'm going to get, so don't get scared away. But focal length, simply stated, is the distance from the objective to where the light focuses. So for a refractor, it's the distance from the lens in the front to the end of the telescope. What does a focal length do? The focal length determines how big the object you're looking at is going to appear. The longer the focal length, the larger the apparent size of the object. Kind of makes sense. But if the object is bigger, then the area of the sky that you're looking at is smaller. And this has some implications that we'll talk about. The longer the focal length, the more precise your mount has to be to follow the object. So we'll show this with just kind of like a little representation. This is a simulation of the Orion Nebula. Okay, so I've depicted two telescopes here, 3-inch refractor and my 11-inch with a 66-inch focal length through using a focal reducer. We don't need to really worry about that too much. The image on the left shows the area of the sky that I would see in the telescope with a 34mm eyepiece. And the circular insert at the top right is kind of what it would look like, although without all that color. So you can see that with the 66-inch focal length, I'm getting a big view of the nebula, but I'm not seeing too much around it. With the smaller focal length, depicted on the bottom right, I'm seeing a great big area around the nebula, but the nebula itself is pretty small. And that's the effect of focal length. And this becomes really important when you're talking about using a camera. Okay, now this is a camera. Now, if you look at the circle on the left and the circle on the right, those are the field of views through that eyepiece I talked about. Now, these boxes in the middle are the field of view that I would get with those two telescopes through a mid-range camera. You can see how tiny that is. The 11-inch is only going to show that little square part of the nebula. The 3-inch, 15-inch focal length is going to show a lot more, but it's still a lot less than you would see through an eyepiece. And that's why I say that you really need a go-to telescope, because trying to point precisely at an object in the sky with a finder precisely enough to get aimed right at the target you're looking for in that small field of view of the camera is very difficult. So you want to consider that when you think about using your equipment and getting a camera, because the other impact comes from the type of camera. Cameras have sensors. The bigger the sensor, basically, the more of the sky you're going to see. So in this case, this is my telescope at two different focal lengths. The shorter focal length gives me a bigger image size. With this camera, which is more modern than the Ultrastar I showed in the previous slide, I can get a lot more of the nebula, but it's still not a lot. I can get like the whole nebula maybe. And then if I'm at a normal focal length of 110 inches, I can only see the center. That circle in the middle is kind of the view I would have in a 17mm eyepiece. I think that's about 150 power, just as it's kind of a comparison, but that's the size of the sky that you're going to see. If you're using maybe a more typical telescope, an 8-inch reflector, and you're using two different cameras, the 294, which has a bigger sensor, would be that big box. The Starlight Ultrastar would be the little box. So the camera and the focal length of your scope both affect how much of the area you're going to see. Now, focal length isn't always bad. I mean, if I wanted to look at M15, this is the view I'd get with my 66-inch focal length. That's a nice view of a globular cluster. In the 15-inch focal length scope, it would look approximately like this, a lot smaller. So your choice of telescope and camera is probably affected a little bit by the objects that you want to look at most. Or if not, you just need to be aware of the kind of results you're going to get. Now, I just want to interject here. Boat owners, often say a boat is a hole in the water into which you throw money. You have to be careful because EAA can be like a black hole into which you throw money. There's always better equipment. There's also always better telescopes, better mounts, and you just have to know what you want to spend because it's easy to get carried away. And you don't really have to buy top-notch equipment to get good results in EAA. The other important thing is F ratio, and that's simply the focal length of the telescope divided by the diameter of your lens or mirror. So what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean a lot, but it determines the light gathering power of your telescope, how bright an extended object is going to look. And then people say how fast the camera is. So a system with a low F number like F2 is going to be able to photograph something with short exposures than one with a bigger F number like F10. So one of the things that is counterintuitive is if I have my 11-inch operating at F6 and you have your 3-inch operating at F6 and you take a photograph, and this only applies to photography, you take a photograph of we'll say the Ring Nebula. Okay, whose photograph is going to be brighter? I have an 11-inch, you have a 3-inch. They're both F6. Well, both images are going to be exactly the same brightness. F number photographically determines the brightness of an extended object. And you say that can't be right. Well, it is right. But I'm not going to try and prove it to you. You just have to take my word for it. Now, you may be sitting there saying, oh, that means I can look at 16 magnitude stars then, because I have an F6 and he has an F6. He can see 16 magnitude. It's not true for point sources like stars. It's only true for extended objects. So it's just something to be aware of. Lower F number, faster exposures, the less time you have to expose. So having said all that, I'm just going to pause for a minute and take a drink. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. So we have talked about the telescope and we've talked about the mounts. So what else do we need for EAA? Well, we need an electronic device, something to capture the images from our telescope. One of the first things you could go out and buy was this thing called an electronic eyepiece. I think it had a 9-volt battery up under the cap. It's kind of a precursor of a webcam. That little plug on the side is an RCA jack, and you'd plug that into a television. And then with that little thumb wheel, you could control the intensity of the image. So you could point your telescope at the moon, you could stick this eyepiece in, and you could look at the moon. You could look at brighter planets, not with real good results, but you could see them. You might be able to see bright stars, but they weren't very good for anything any dimmer than a first or second magnitude. And nebula was you had to use your imagination. But that was kind of like the first mass-produced device for electronic observing. Today, you could use a webcam and put it in an eyepiece adapter, stick it in your telescope, and you'd have the same thing. Okay, the next device, which requires nothing extra, is a night vision device. Now, the use of these in astronomy is relatively new. TeleVue makes an adapter so you can attach one of these directly to your eyepiece holder. It uses a photomultiplier tube to enhance received lights. Now, if you've watched spy movies, you've seen them looking at people crawling through the trees in the dark, and they stand out perfectly well. Well, that's what this is. The photons come into this through the lens end of the device. They hit the photomultiplier tube, which pops off a whole bunch of electrons against the phosphor screen, intensifying the image. And it's looking through this is just like looking through an eyepiece. As far as the light comes in, it goes right to your eye. Now, the images are either green or white. I believe they're coming out with some color ones now, but they're even green or white. They're extremely expensive. But what you see is something like this. This is the California Nebula. So, and I don't know what size scope this was attached to, but this is the nebula, and this is what you see. Well, it's not quite what you see. What you see is this. And that's because there are stray electrons being generated as well as the ones from the light sources. But it definitely intensifies the image. And if you were then photographing this, it wouldn't bother you as much with the little speckles. Okay, then we move on to integrated systems, and these are still available. Malancam, the system there on the left, is made by a company in Canada. Basically, it's a camera control, and a power supply. You would attach that to your telescope eyepiece, or in place of your telescope eyepiece. You would plug it into a display, an LCD, LED type display, and you could then see images collected by the camera. Requires no other software. Everything you need other than the display device is in that system. Over on the right, the next thing to come along was a Revolution Imager, which is still available. And this is exactly the same. It's a camera, a control device, a power supply, but in addition, it has a little 5x5 LCD screen. And once again, if you get your telescope pointed at an object, you'll get an image on that screen. And that image can include nebula, planets, moons, stars. It's an inexpensive device, but it works fairly well. I don't know why my slides keep going back. It must be the way I'm moving my mouse. Okay, now we're going to move on to imaging devices. Now, this is a little more complicated than the systems that I've shown so far because you have to use more stuff with them. Okay. Now, the simplest imaging device is the standard DSLR camera. And you used to be able to say, well, everybody has one. Well, these days, they've been supplanted to a large extent for casual use by phones. But they are still available, and they're still pretty popular. Now, if you're going to use a DSLR camera for EAA, that camera must have either a USB output or a Wi-Fi output, because somehow you have to get each picture that you take to your display device. And many of the cameras come with that. You also need an eyepiece adapter, which commonly replaces the lens on the front and allows you to connect it directly to your telescope. These cameras are color only, which for EAA, that's fine, no problem. The one issue is they're not real sensitive to red light. And so for astronomy uses, their display is not optimum, but there are plenty of fine pictures taken with these cameras. And one of the main advantages of this camera is its dual use. You can talk to your significant other and say, you know, I've been thinking, we need a new camera. That way I can take pictures of you, the kids, the dog, the house, the Andromeda Nebula. And maybe you can get somebody convinced to buy it that way. But they do work, and if you have one, it's a good way to get involved. Moving on up, we have the ASTROCAMERA, the dedicated ASTROCAMERA. They come in all sorts of different shapes. These are just two of them. They come with CCD or CMOS chips, and that's just the way the signal is processed, and I'm not going to get into that. for these purposes, they're basically the same. Everybody knows that CCD is charge coupled device. Who knows what CMOS is? I just thought I'd mention this worthless information. It's complementary metal oxide semiconductor. Now that's very important. It'll be covered on the quiz at the end. But seriously, either camera, as far as EAA is concerned, is fine. Color or monochrome, just a word on that. If you're getting into EAA and you're buying a camera for EAA, get a color camera. Astrophotographers will argue that the monochrome is better, and for astrophotography, it may be. But seeing things in color with the simplicity of a color camera, even though its resolution is a little less, even though its sensitivity is a little less, will show you more than you've ever seen. And for EAA, I don't think there's any reason to have anything other than a color camera. Just my opinion. All right, so you've got the telescope, the mount, the camera, but now you need a computer. Why? Because EAA requires the image from the camera to be processed somehow. Now, the computer can be a Mac running OS X, a computer running Windows, a computer running a version of Linux. It can be a laptop or phone running Android or iOS. There is software available for all those devices. But just like anything else, the vast amount or the vast number of astronomical programs for EAA and astrophotography run on Windows. I am a Mac fanatic. I love Macs. I run my business on a Mac. I have a Windows computer to run my astrophotography software. Not because it has better software, but it has more software. And I can do more things with it without having to jump through hoops. But you do need a computer of some sort to work with your camera. I mentioned you need software. You need EAA software. A lot of this software is free. A lot of it only runs on Windows. A lot of it is only run on a camera made by a certain company. For example, Starlight Live, which I showed earlier, only works with Starlight Express cameras. ATIC Affinity, that's another Astro camera. Their software only supports ATIC cameras. There's a software package called ASI Live, which is manufactured by SWO. That will only run ASI cameras. On the other hand, these programs like SharpCap and AstroToaster, which I don't name, just what they're called, they will support most cameras, but they only run on Windows. So you just have to kind of think ahead on what you want to do and what you can get before you go out and buy something new. You also need telescope control software, something that will help your telescope find the objects and track them once they are found. When I talk about the software, you saw basically the screen for Starlight Live. All the software is similar. It all has panels where you can set exposures, do some exposure control, and maybe modify the image a little bit as it's being captured. This is an older program. This SharpCap is one of the newer and more popular programs for EAA, and it has a screen that shows the image that you're capturing, has all your settings and controls on the right, and then has what's called a histogram, which is a fancy name for a graph, which you can manipulate to improve your image as you're watching it. So that's what the software does. But you're kind of in this, which comes first, chicken or the egg? If you have a computer that you want to use for astronomy, then you can you have to make sure you buy software that runs on that computer. And then you have to make sure you buy a camera that can be operated by that software that can run on that computer. Or if you have a camera, which is unlikely, but if you have a camera and no computer, then you need to make sure that the computer you buy can run the software that supports that camera. So just do some planning ahead of time. Now, I gave this presentation a couple of years ago to my own club, And this wasn't even discussed because these are relatively new. If you don't want to mess around with trying to figure out what's compatible with what, you can buy these all-in-one devices. They have the software to do EAA, to take and process the pictures. They have software to find objects, and they have software to track those objects. So they're also equipped with Wi-Fi, so you don't need to have wires. You do need to have a power supply to it. But you have this little box, and you can see the size. This is about the size of your hand. And it includes everything you need except the camera and except the display device. But all the software is already installed. You just need to learn how to run it. This particular box costs $300, approximately. I think it's a little less now. Here's the same thing by another manufacturer. Does the same thing, has integrated software, does a lot of power control functions to other devices. This is almost $2,000. So in between the 300 and the 2,000, there are a lot of intermediate steps. But if you don't want to have to figure out software compatibility and equipment compatibility, all you have to do is look at these devices, see what cameras they support and what telescopes they support, and just buy one of them. And these are generally of a size small enough that you could actually mount them on your telescope. And that would avoid the necessity of running a whole bunch of cables up your mount that you then have to worry about getting tangled. In the same class, you can also roll your own. This is a picture of a little computer called a Raspberry Pi. It runs a Linux operating system. You need to be a bit of a computer nerd, but you can get public domain software that will do all the stuff you need for EAA and install it on here. It runs off 5 volts, so you can power from a USB outlet. And you can do everything with this $100 box that you can do with the other two, pretty much. But once again, you have to be a little bit of a computer geek to set one of these things up. But today, more than any other time, you have a lot more options for how you can do EAA. Okay, telescope, mount, capture device, display. You need a display. Now, if you're running your computer software on a laptop or an iPhone or a phone, Android or iPhone, or a tablet, then you already have a display device that will work. You can display your images on those devices. You can also use an LED monitor, but the size of the device you use to display the object is somewhat dependent on the audience. If it's just you, might be perfectly happy looking at your phone. Okay, if you're trying to show this to other people, you may want a larger display. I use a 15-inch laptop. Another member of our club uses a 13-inch tablet. But you know, if you have the facilities, there's no reason why you couldn't use a larger monitor. The one final thing you need is power. And this is easy to overlook, but it's kind of important. Now, if you have a GOTO telescope, you have some kind of power supply already. Something like on the bottom left, the Celestron power tank is a lithium battery that you can plug your equipment into. It will power your scope. It will power your camera for a night. But if you need other stuff like dew heaters, something to keep dew off your telescope objective, and some other equipment like electronic focusers, you might need another power supply. If you're operating at home and you have an outlet available, you can run everything off of AC. You can plug an extension cord into your house. Make sure you use the GFCI circuit so you don't get electrocuted. But you can run an extension cord out to your scope, put it in a power strip, and then on the right, bottom right there, most astronomy equipment all comes with these wall warts that convert AC to DC for the particular equipment. So you can run it off of there. But now if you're in a situation where you don't have external power, what do? Well, in many cases, you can run it off a larger battery if you need to. You can use a marine battery, which is deep cycle. It's used to being charged and discharged numerous times. You can take that power, that 12-volt power. A battery is, by the way, is from 14 to 12 volts. So even though equipment says it's 12 volts, almost all of it will run from 14 down to 12 volts. When you get below 12 volts on a battery, it's basically discharged. But you can use this marine battery. You can run your wires from that battery to your equipment and power your equipment off of 12 volts or 5 volts with a little converter. Or you can take the output from the battery and run it into that central object there on the top, an inverter, and that converts the 12 volts to 110 volts. And then you can plug your AC power devices into that. Now that's a little inefficient. You know, you're going from 12 volts to 110 back to 12. So you're losing stuff. But for a single night's observation, you can do that if your battery is big enough and depending what the demands are. Big downside is the weight. A marine battery, let's say you need something with 50 amp hours because you've got a lot of equipment. That could weigh anywhere between 50 and 80 pounds. Now there are newer batteries coming out, lithium iron phosphate batteries, which that 50 amp hour battery would probably weigh around 30 pounds instead of 50. It would also cost 5 times as much. No matter what, you've got to consider how you're going to power the equipment that you get. And once again, although I'm not going to discuss it in this presentation, you got to figure out how you're going to get the wires from the power supply to the equipment on the telescope without wrapping it all up as you observe during the night. All right, so we talked about the equipment, but how does this work when you're using a camera? Okay, the camera chip collects and processes light. Well, not really light. I mean, it takes the photons as it hits the chip and does something with it to convert it into electrons. So you end up with this chip with basically a pile of electrons sitting on it. And then you have to do something to those electrons. And that is processing. Now, to back up just a second, and this isn't exactly accurate, but I'm going to call each one of these blocks pixels. If you have a color camera, the most common array of that camera chip are in blocks of 4, blue, red, green, and green. It's called a Bayer matrix, named after Professor Bayer, who worked for Kodak, and he came up with the idea and the method by which you could use digital cameras to duplicate film cameras. And he found that the combination of 2 green pixels, 1 red and 1 blue, most closely matched film cameras. And that's how he set up the chip. Now, this is great. Now, if you have a monochrome camera, all the chips, all the cells, all are sensitive to all light. So with a color camera, if you're photographing a hydrogen alpha nebula, that red light comes down here. If it hits the red cell, the red filtered cell, that's fine. You get the light. If it hits the green or the blue, it's gone. It's rejected. You don't get that at all. So a monochrome camera, in broad terms, is 4 times as sensitive as the color camera because all of its chips are sensitive to all of the light. It's not strictly true. And once again, for EAA, you're not going to notice the difference. Okay, you want a color camera. I can't emphasize that enough. Astrophotography is different. Okay, so you got the photons and then you have an image, right? Well, it's not that simple. You have an image, but it's really dim. It's really a dim image. Now, once again, these are all broad statements. But it turns out that if I take 10 6-second exposures, or I take 1 60-second exposure, the image, if I put them all together, are going to be exactly the same. So why not take shorter exposures? By adding each short exposure image to the other, I can negate small tracking errors in my telescope, and I can end up with a very good image with moderate tracking ability. And that's what EAA does. So I'm taking photos, and I'm basically taking 10 images maybe, or 20, or however many I'm going to take, and I'm putting them one on top of the other. Now this is a simulation, so this isn't exactly what you'd see, but you start out with a dimmer image, and then as the images are stacked, you can see more and more detail begins to appear. Now remember this star, by the way, out here to the left. It's a bright star. Okay, so we're stacking the images. If this was for real, that kind of noisy background would actually decrease. Okay, so let's pretend that these white dots represent that bright star that we looked at on each image. So the first image I take, it's sitting here. Now my telescope isn't tracking exactly right. So when I take the second image, it's down here instead of where it was in the first. Well, the software you use for EAA automatically says, oh, that's not in the right place. I'm going to move everything in the second frame up to where it was in the first frame. You take the third image and same thing. Oh, I'm going to move everything in this third frame up to where it was in the first frame. So that guarantees that as each image comes in, it's actually right on top of the previous one, aligned exactly the same, and it intensifies the image. So now you kick the tripod as it's taken the fourth image, and this thing is way off. Once again, the EAA software is smart enough to say, wait a minute, that can't be. So I'm going to reject that image. If the next image it takes is back within limits on the first three, then it'll continue to stack them. Otherwise, it'll continue to ignore them. So that's how it improves the image. That's why stacking actually negates some small errors in your telescope tracking. The other thing the EAA software does is helps reduce camera noise. Now, I don't know how this shows up on your monitors, but this is not a photograph of a dim star field. This is my ultrastar camera with absolutely no light coming in. And we still see, quote, light. What is it? Well, the CCD chip is, or the CMOS chip is dumb, okay? It can't tell the difference between heat and a photon. So as heat is generated, you can get these spurious signals. This particular photo would be called a dark frame. And through the modern magic of computers, all this extra noise can be subtracted out of the images that I'm stacking. So without doing anything, just by having a dark frame available, I can get rid of a lot of noise in my pictures. Okay, so that's enough about theory. Here's my setup. And I just mentioned this Paramount Mighty mount is a research grade mount. I mean, it's really a good mount, and you do not need something that good to do EAA. I just happen to have it. There's my scope, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. It's an SCT. It's not ideal for EAA because it's got a relatively long focal length. It's relatively heavy, and it needs a very good mount to track adequately. This is the business end. This is my ultrastar color camera fit into an eyepiece adapter. This USB cord ultimately ends up down in my computer, which processes the signal. This is my high-tech laptop. It's in a foam box, which I made out of Omaha steak remnants. But it's very important that you protect your laptop if you're using one from dew, and in my case, from frost. So you need some kind of protection around it. The other thing I do want to mention, if you are doing EAA, along with astronomers doing visual astronomy, you have to be careful where you set up because you may not be very popular. Because no matter how careful you are going to have light coming out of your laptop. Even if you have it red, there's going to be a significant amount of light, and visual astronomers trying to stay dark adapted are not going to be pleased. So be considerate if you're doing both in the same area as to where you set up. Gray box underneath contains my battery and computer. Okay, so here we go. My system is set up, and I'm going ahead and I'm going to do EAA. So I've got some settings that I know work, so I'm kind of presetting them. And then I'm going to go ahead and take the pictures. Now, one nice thing about EAA is you don't have to do just EAA. I can do EAA in the field, but I can save these images. So when I get back to the house, I can take them and I can do astrophotography processing on them. So it's not either or, you can actually do both. So I'm setting this up for 10-second exposures, and I'm just going to go ahead and start taking it. This is a relatively bright object. So you'll see the first thing that shows up are the stars. And you may see a little hit of nebulosity. But as the frames come in, you can see to the left of that bar, it tells you that I've taken one image and it's stacked one. I've taken two images and I've stacked two. And now you can probably start to make out the famous apple core nebula. At least that's what it looks like to me. I think it's commonly called the horseshoe. I'm sorry, the dumbbell nebula. But anyway, you can see that as it comes in, you see color. I mean, and that is just amazing. It's especially amazing if you've looked at these things for years in monochrome. All of a sudden, you're seeing the colors that exist out there. Now, with each frame, the image is improving.
Bob?
Yes.
This is Brian Cash, and I have a question for you about setting exposures.
Sure.
Do you use the histogram to set it, or some other rule, or what? How do you set your exposures on EAA? Since you're going to stack them anyway.
Right. I'll tell you what I do. I say, I've done this for a while. I say, well, I'm going to try 10 seconds, and I'm going to look at it, and yes, I'm getting enough image. And then I can play, once I start getting the image, I can start playing with the histogram to get the exposure, to adjust the exposure. The really limiting thing for me on the exposure is the tracking. Even with my mount, because the focal length of the telescope is so long, if I try and take like a 60-second exposure, I mean, it may work or it may not. I may get trailing. So I just decided, look, it looks to me like I'm getting enough signal at 10 seconds or 3 seconds, and I'm just going to stack them, and then I'm going to play with a histogram. And the nice thing about this is if it doesn't work, I just do it again with a different exposure. It's something that I know right away. So I don't know if that's answered your question, Ron. I'm just going to move on here. Okay, this is obviously depending on the object. For example, I used 10 seconds on that one. Okay, so I'm doing this one, and because I knew this was a very dim object, I said I'm going to do 45-second exposures. Now, I'm not going to make you sit here and watch this thing expose for 45 seconds each frame. It's going to do this first frame, and then I'm going to speed it up. This particular software, although I don't show it, it also has a histogram type thing where you can fiddle around and adjust things. So here's the first picture, 45 seconds. I'd say, well, I think I'm getting enough signal, so I'm going to leave it go with that. Now I've sped it up just so you can see it. If you look down to the left of that bar, you'll see that in a minute, right there, I've taken 3 images, but one of them, for whatever reason, it wouldn't stack it. So it skipped it. So now it's going on. It's done 4 images, but it's only stacked 3 of them, and it's going to continue. So here you can see the bubble nebula start to appear. And now we're down to like the last frame, and I've stopped it. There's, on this software, which is kind of basic, this is, I can adjust then basically a dynamic range. I can adjust that a little bit and try and improve the image. I could also do this while the images were being taken. This doesn't affect the source images. It only affects the display images. If I wanted to, I could make this monochrome. I could really blow out the colors or whatever. But there's a lot of possibilities. Let's see if I can get to the next one here. Okay, this is a very important point. EAA is not astrophotography. You use the same equipment and you speak kind of the same language. You talk about frames, you talk about exposures, you talk about dark frames maybe, and you get pictures from both of them. But this is astrophotography. Okay, this is not my photo, by the way. It's a guy called Anis Abdul who posts on cloudy nights. This is his image of NGC 891. Okay, this is a 10-hour exposure. And that doesn't mean he went out at 6 o'clock at night in the winter and started taking the picture, and 10 hours later he stopped the camera and took this picture out. That 10 hours of exposure could have been made over days, weeks, months, maybe even years. And then after he had all the images that he wanted to use, he had to process them into this final image. And that was probably at least 10 hours of processing, maybe more. But this is astrophotography, and you can get some beautiful pictures. You're not going to get beautiful pictures like this in EAA. Okay. Now, this next image is my view of this object in EAA. Absolutely no processing on a full moon night. And that's what it looks like. You can see there's background noise. You can see the stars are a little bit trailed. In spite of that, in 5 minutes, I got this image. And this is something that I have never seen visually. I might get a faint glimpse of that dust band on a monochrome haze. But this is what I saw in EAA after 5 minutes. And after this 5 minutes, I had all these images saved. I could go back and look at them later. But in the meantime, I could go on and look at another object. I didn't have to spend my whole evening or number of evenings doing the same thing. At my age, I realize that my observing time is probably limited, so I want to see as many different objects as I can. Okay, now here's some other images. No processing, generally moonlit nights. You can see on the picture of M101, all those little speckles, that's all noise. That was on a summer night without a dark frame. And you can see the effect. In spite of that, I've seen a lot more on that than I ever saw visually on M101. Ring Nebula over on the left, you get some nice colors. Swan Nebula and the Lagoon Nebula. I do have to tell you one quick thing about the Swan Nebula. That was one of the first things that I got a picture of. And I was running from my office from my scope outside. And I was so impressed, I cleared the image and I called my wife in and I said, Billy, you have to see this. This is spectacular. And I started taking the frames. And you could see the frames build up. Okay, but with each frame, my screen stayed black. And after about 3 or 4 minutes of looking at a black screen, my wife said, very impressive, and went back to the television. I immediately went out to the scope, checked my cables, checked everything else. Everything looked to be working. I couldn't figure out what was wrong. And then I looked at where the scope was pointing. And the Swan Nebula had moved behind a tree in my backyard. And that's something even EAA won't overcome. M16, NGC 7479, a couple other areas. And once again, these are all, 30-second, probably max of 30-second exposures stacked. On the left, the Blue Snowball Nebula. Now, with my scope, I did get a slight bluish tinge to that if I looked at it visually, but obviously a lot more apparent with EAA. Cat's Eye Nebula on the right. Okay, so that's those objects. Can you use it for the moon and for planets? Yes, you can, but you have to remember something. When you're looking at planets and the moon, you're not stacking frames as you watch them. It's actually like watching a movie. So depending on the frame rate you can get the exposures taken at, you're going to have atmospheric distortion. Now, seeing in my area is terrible. But this is representative of what you'd see. And even if you were doing this visually, you'd see the same kind of stuff. And looking at something like the moon is spectacular, whether you're doing it visually or you're doing it through a camera. And the advantage of doing this in EAA is if you wanted to point out certain features to someone, you can put your finger on the screen and say, see this here, this is what I'm talking about, as opposed to trying to direct their eye without knowing exactly where they're looking. So yes, you can view this on the moon. You can use planets. The issue with planets is this. Okay, once again, seeing is atrocious in my neck of the woods. and that's Jupiter. All right. Once again, you're seeing the atmospheric distortion. And if you were looking with your eye through an eyepiece, you would actually see a little more detail than this because your eye can adjust to rapid changes in detail. So you'd actually be seeing a better picture, possibly visually, than you're seeing this. Now, it doesn't mean the detail isn't there. I mean, I could take that image and I could process it and I could come out with that image on the right. So there's detail there, but you just aren't going to see it in EAA. That image on the right is processed after the fact. It's not EAA. Okay, if you're doing EAA for outreach, and these are just suggestions, and I mean that, they're just suggestions, they're not rules. I recommend you pick bright and colorful objects because most people who have looked through a telescope have not seen the images in color. And they don't really associate your little telescope with Hubble images. They're really impressed by any color you can show. If you're stacking frames, which you would be with EAA, keep the individual exposure short if you can, 30 seconds or less. And the reason for that is, depending again on your audience, people's attention span can be short. So if they have to stare at a screen for 30 seconds with nothing happening, and then something happens, and then another 30 seconds, something else minor happens, they can lose interest, okay? So try and keep the exposure short. Have pre-programmed objects.
Hey, Bob, that's why I don't
Yep.
like football, because there's too much downtime. I'm always looking for the action.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I'm a soccer fan myself. But have some pre-programmed objects. You know, have a plan. You know, go from object A to B to C to D. Yes, there are people going to say, well, can you show me this? Yeah, you can. But if somebody says, I want to see quasar umpty-ump, he may be extremely interested in that. And you can find it. And you can show him that dim little speck on the screen. And he'll be really impressed. And the other 20 people around there will be saying, what are we doing here? So, yes, I mean, obviously people want to do something. If they stick around, you can do whatever you want. But for the general audience, have some pre-programmed objects that you can move to quickly, one to the other. Use an appropriate display. You know, showing the image on your phone is fine if you're the one looking at it, or, you know, you got your pal that you can show 6 feet away, show him the phone. But if you're showing, you know, to 5, 10, 15 people, you probably want to send the image to a bigger display. And one thing I didn't mention, if at all possible, have your connections from your scope location to the display wireless, because you don't need somebody tripping across an Ethernet cable in the dark. So use wireless whenever possible. And finally, if you can, and I think everybody knows this, do a dry run with the objects you're going to look at and the equipment. Now, here in central New York, that's tough because, you know, there may be 30 days between observing days where you can see anything. But if you can, do a dry run just to make sure that, you know, what you're going to look at is going to look like what you think and that your equipment is working fine. Just sources for further information. If you're interested in EAA, go to cloudynights.com and look at their EAA observation and equipment forum. Tons of posts there, tons of sample images, a lot of advice, and advice is, you know, worth what you pay for it. So you have to kind of judge different opinions, but there's plenty of information there and it's a good place to get started. I've listed a couple of vendors there, not better or worse than any other vendors. They're only listed there because the Astro cameras they sell have nice descriptions. So you can kind of read through the specifications and things like that. But if you're going to look at anything and you haven't, look at the Cloudy Nights forum first. And that's really
Bob?
all I got. Yes.
I just, you go back to the last slide, just to comment that it's, I think it's optcorp.com.
Oh, did I have? Yeah, let me go back. I think you're right. Yeah. www.optcorp.com. Yeah. And if you do a search on the web, you know, for telescopes, you'll get a lot of vendors popping up. And like I say, no, I'm not recommending these above any others. They're just places that have good write-ups for their equipment. I'm
Okay.
sorry I went over a little bit.
No, that's okay. I view it as just an opportunity to learn more fascinating information, but I'm not an equipment person. I'm an equipment dummy. So I'm going to ask the question. I've been to some star gazing events where they have what back then at the Stokes Star Party was, I guess, EAA, and the images on the screen were the red color, not the white. So how do you get the red computer screen so you're not disturbing night vision?
You can buy film. It's like acetate that you can put over your screens and cover them over so it goes through. There's also software that will change most of your screen to red, but usually you'll find that part of the screen does not change. So you get these acetate filters that you just can tape over your screen or around your screen. And that does decrease the light. Unfortunately for me, it also decreased what I was able to read on the screen. So I had a problem with that. But you can get red filters to go over your screens if you're using a laptop.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Say, Bob, this is Art Trevina. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay, great. Do you have any special tips for doing electronically assisted astronomy in the era of COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think it's the way to go. For example, our club has had a couple of star parties, public star parties. And what we have done, I think there were 2 of us there with EAA scopes. And basically, it was not a giant crowd. It was a small crowd. But we were able to set up the telescope and a distance away because we were using Wi-Fi. In my case, I had the computer monitor sitting on an observing chair in one case and on a picnic table in the other. And then people staying 6 feet apart could still get close enough to that device to see what I was displaying.
Great.
Yeah. Now, once again, if you've got big attendance, like 30 or 40 people, then either you're going to need a bigger screen, or you're going to have to somehow manage the flow of people. Yeah.
Right.
Have you tried any events with using a projector as opposed to monitors?
Yeah, we have not, and that's just because our facilities don't really lend themselves to that. The one thing I would say, if you use a projector, that will give you a very good image. You just have to make sure then, though, if you're using that kind of image, and I don't know what, I know projectors can project basically any size, but let's say you're blowing it up to 65 inches or even, equivalent. You got to make sure that the audience is far enough away to where they can appreciate it. Because if you're looking at an image that big, from 3 feet away, it's not going to be all that great.
And you have to serve popcorn with a big screen too.
But on the other hand, we want them far away in the era of COVID-19, right?
oh yeah, I mean that's what I'm saying. If you have a big image, right, just make sure you have the people back. And for COVID-19, that's not a bad idea. They can be spread out and they can still see something.
Hey, Art, maybe we should all start wearing garlic necklaces to keep other people.
Yeah, there you go.
Bob, Ken Alavey. So if you're projecting off of a monitor, the numbers that I'm familiar with are like 720, 1080. How much definition are you showing?
And that depends on the camera. Most of them are at least 1080p, and some are, for what is I can't think of the numbers. Is it 420? What 40?
4K.
4K. Not 4K. The one below 4K. Oh, maybe just 4K.
Like 2140, I think.
2140. Yeah, I mean that's typically what we've been using. It's really, I mean, the images are, the images are going to be good. They're going to be spectacular, especially to somebody who's not, you know, an astrophotographer who really knows what a great image looks like. But no, a standard, you know, 2140 monitor, I mean, displays them fine. And if you're showing them, and once again, this wouldn't be for an audience, it'd be personal. You know, if you look at them on your phone, I mean, they look great. Of course, that's a, you know, a small image.
Thank you.
Bob, this is Vance Franks. Question, have you any experience with the focal reducers on the SCTs?
I use a focal reducer on my SCT. I use the Celestron, what is it, 6.6. Anyway, it gets it down to about f6.
Did you have any problems with the back focus on using your camera? Because I've got a Revolution 2 imager, but not enough whiskey to keep me up to speed to get this thing working. So something I'm doing is wrong. Yeah.
There is an issue with that, because you need to have for a Celestron. If you have a Celestron, their 6.3 focal reducer requires I'm trying to think. It's not 55 millimeters. It's like 100 and something, like 130 millimeters of back focus.
Okay.
And so that can be an issue. My focuser is, I use electronic focuser, but that's adapted to that. So I can get to the right back focus as long as I don't try and use any kind of guiding camera. If I try and use an off-axis guider, then my back focus is off. But you can still, even if you can't get the right back focus, you still get focal reduction. It just may be more or less than you expect, and therefore you may get some vignetting or some distorted stars at the edge. But I mean, it will work as long as you're close. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, if anybody has any more questions for Bob, let's have them. If not, I want to really thank Bob for that, opening up a door for us to do some future public events. We've been thinking and talking about this a long time, and I guess waiting to see what coronavirus would do, but it's not going anywhere, and we have to go somewhere and forge ahead with the club and events. So I think this is invaluable information for us, and thank Bob for sharing his knowledge and opening up that door of possibilities for us.
Oh, you're welcome. Now I'm just trying to figure out how I give control back to you.
If you have a list of participants, you can just go up to my name and click on more, and then there's an option to make me the co-host.
Why don't I see? Oh, I see. There must be.
It's probably not critical that I am. We're just going to continue with the meeting. I think Terry's already the co-host, so he can probably make me the co-host again. But as long as you don't click the end meeting button, we're okay.
Hey, hey, Bob, this is Terry Hancock here. Before you head off, I just wanted to thank you for doing a great presentation. And like Nancy was saying, you know, we have to look ahead, the future for public events. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
And electronically assisted astronomy is a good option for us to look at when we have public events. One thing that we don't want to be doing when we have public events in the future, when we resume, I mean, this coronavirus could go on forever, who knows? But in the meantime, when we do start to get to be doing the public events again, rather than have people looking through telescopes using an eyepiece, we talked about this a few months ago, and having some volunteers from the astronomy come up with their telescopes, doing EAA is a good option. People won't need to be touching equipment, putting their eyes through the eyepiece, and yeah, and it's not that difficult to set up and not that expensive. as Bob mentioned, you can use an altazimuth telescope. You don't need to have an equatorial mount. And if anyone is interested in doing this, you know, when we look at doing the events again, you can either contact me or Nancy or Isaac, and we'll certainly assist you in getting set up with the equipment that's needed. And Isaac actually had offered to train people using the software, which would probably be SharpCap. And but yeah, Isaac is happy to do a training session for anyone that wants to volunteer and do it. When we're fortunate that with the roll-off roof observatory, that we do have a big screen on the outside of the building. And so it's my plan, rather than have people come through the observatory and not be able to social distance, I'm going to be doing live stacking on the big screen out the front. So anyway, that's what we're hoping to do in the future. Again, Bob, I want to thank you for tonight's great presentation, and thanks for everyone participating. And I'll hand it back to you, Nancy.
Okay, Terry, if you could make me the co-host again, just in case I need it, but don't worry about it, Bob. And thanks again. So I'm going to have a little bit of a business meeting here again for those who are from the other clubs who are totally intrigued by our internal workings. You're welcome to hang in there. If not, I'd like to request that the WCAC folks stay on for about another 10 minutes because we have a lot going on with the club and I'd like to share it with everybody. So with that being said, thanks again, Bob. And I will delve into these. The first thing I want to talk about is COVID safety. I have unfortunately learned that at least 2, and maybe more that I don't know of, members of our very own club have or have had coronavirus. So of course, we're wishing them speedy recoveries, and I think they're well on the road to that, but it is out there and we're surrounded by it. So please, everybody, please be safe and don't take it for granted that there's vaccines or that we don't have to social distance anymore. Be safe and stay healthy. I wanted to make some announcements. As you know, our club has grown, and we, by the bylaws, have had to add a second member at large. And we also, very unfortunately and very untimely, lost our friend Chris Phillips, who was our member at large. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So we have 2 folks that, and I've been tied up with some very critical personal business, so this all kind of got put off, but now it's getting organized. And so we have 2 members at large who will be acting members at large because we don't have elections again until next year. And that is going to be Vance Franks and Lorraine Zentz. So they will be members at large for the club. And I'm also very excited that after 4 years of searching and pleading, and Ken and I fretting about the fact that we do not have anybody to be a PR representative for the club, we finally found a brave person who is Chris Melendez, who has agreed to be a PR representative for the club. And this means that she will help promote events that we're having to the public, newspapers, radio, any other venues that we can use to promote the club activities, and let people know that there's great astronomy going on here on the Western Slope, because not a lot of people, believe it or not, are not aware of that and things that they can do relating to astronomy. So Chris has agreed to undertake that. It is my hope to modify our bylaws for the next election so that we can have the members, well, the members at large will be reelected, and we will also add webmaster and PR representative to our official board of the club. So that, I think we have all the bases covered in the age of technology. Our webmaster is very critical, and we must have a PR person to promote our club. So that's exciting news, and I think we're looking at a nice, well-rounded board of directors for the club. I'm just going to put a plug in here because I know Ken is watching me like a hawk there, that dues for the club were payable at the beginning of the year. And certainly anybody doesn't want to not be a member of our amazing club anymore. So Ken had sent an email, and he'll send some reminders about ways in which you can pay your dues. So I just wanted to thank everybody for their continuing support and mention about the dues that are coming doable. We do need a speaker for the March meeting and a program. I was supposed to, my presentation last year got nipped in the bud by the coronavirus, and I had rescheduled myself for this March, and now I have pressing family matters that have to be tended to, so I cannot be the March speaker. So we do need a program and a speaker for our March meeting. If anybody can volunteer for that, or knows somebody who can volunteer, or can coerce somebody into volunteering, I would definitely welcome having a speaker and program for March. We will be scheduling a board meeting, as I said, with 3 new additions. We desperately need to regroup and figure out how we're going to go forward with spring and summer coming, and whether or not we can do public events and things like that. So I will be scheduling a board meeting. I'll let everybody know when it is, because members are welcomed and encouraged to attend, even if they're not on the board. Our website has had a number of fiascos going on recently, and it actually disappeared off of the internet for about 3 weeks. And then when our webmaster tried to get back on, he was not allowed to log in. So there were files missing. We were online with our tech people, but Robert is working on it. And he and Ken and I will have a brief meeting to get our website back up and running. But as in one of my favorite movies, The Martian said, we're going to get there. So our website will be back and will be better than ever at some point. And the last thing I want to mention is that, again, unfortunately and shockingly, we lost Chris Phillips to a sudden death overnight from New Year's Eve into New Year's Day. Chris does not have a lot of family here locally. So I put together, with the help of people's input and comments about Chris, who was a very private man, so it was hard for us to get a lot of information. I put together a very nice memorial for Chris, and I did not want to do it in conjunction with tonight's meeting. Chris was very special, and he deserves his private little memorial. So I'm going to schedule a Zoom meeting for sometime within the next week or 2 weeks at the latest. And I would definitely encourage all of our club members to participate. It'll only take about 10 or 15 minutes, and it will honor our friend Chris. So you'll all get information about that, and I encourage everybody to attend. I think it'll make you smile and bring a tear to your eye, and it will be our respectful goodbye to Chris. So I just wanted to know, I'm rambling on like somebody from New Jersey, which I was, but I wanted to know if anybody else had anything they wanted to bring up or discuss before we all part ways this evening. You can just.
This is Ken Alvey. I'm going to get out a second letter as far as our membership drive, and I'm going to add to it information link for PayPal. So hopefully that will help anybody that hasn't renewed their membership to this date. And also to thank everybody that has, because your support is vital to the club, and the club is becoming an important tool to the community. So we're interacting with the Grand Valley in a way that a lot of people just don't realize. And I will try to mention that in my email that's going to come out perhaps tomorrow. So, so thank you all who have renewed, and we will add to the opportunity to renew or become a new member through this next email. So
And
thank you.
I mirror what Ken said about our importance to the community, because we are, as you know, have started to undertake an initiative against light pollution and decreasing light pollution here in the Grand Valley. So we, the club and the other clubs in the area, will definitely need all hands on deck to keep our very nice dark skies out here. So I know that a lot of work has done by BCAS and some of the people in the communities down further, a little bit southeast of us, but that initiative has to be expanded. We sit on top of Grand Junction, which is a big light polluter in this area. So the work that we do is going to be increasingly important in education and awareness. So again, I thank everybody for being club members and for helping with that. Does anybody else have anything that they want to bring up? Okay, well, since nobody's, oh, sorry.
Yeah, one last thing. You know, our presentations, our meetings every month, if anybody has ideas or suggestions, things that they're interested in, let us know. And we'll look into it as far as how we set up our presentations throughout the year.
Yes, we're always looking for diversity and for new ideas for programs. We're trying not to be too repetitive and bring various things of interest to us and the other clubs with whom we're participating. I also want to add that we're very nicely integrated with our sister club, BCAS. I'm a member of BCAS. Art Trevina is now also a member of our club. So we're working in conjunction with another awesome astronomy club, and of course the folks back in Central New York. So it's a nice community, and I appreciate the interconnectedness of all of the clubs.
This is Brian Cash, and I'm with the Black Canyon Astronomical Society, and I want to echo Nancy's words about working together, and at the same time express our appreciation for Nancy being willing to give one of our monthly meetings this year. So she and I will have to talk about if there's any way that we can reciprocate to WCAC.
Oh, you guys have more than reciprocated. You and Art have both given presentations for our club. So we're definitely way grateful for you guys.
Nancy, I'd like to say that I really appreciate all of the work that you have put in to make this small club so vibrant in the Western Slope. I've been members of many other clubs that are large, and this one has done just as much of an impact as those guys have.
Well, I appreciate your comments, Barb. Thank you very much. And it's a team effort. We have a great club full of people, and they're all very willing, including yourself, to jump in and help with public events and at meetings. And from little details to big details, our club members are awesome, and we have a great team of people. So it's makes me proud to be a part of that team of people. Okay, guys, does anybody else have burning, or do we all go and now have our leftover Chinese food for dinner? Okay, well, thanks again for participating. And again, I will send information about a Zoom meeting for Chris Phillips, and I would very much like to see everybody participate. It will only take about 10 minutes, and I think it will honor him. So thank you, everybody. I will end the meeting, and there will be a recording available if anybody missed anything and wants to watch it again. Thanks, guys and gals, and let's keep on keeping on.
Good night,
everyone.
Clear skies, friends.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.